They destroyed the temple up until modern era. That was basically when the last time Israel existed. We're not going to heaven. We're all coming back here with new bodies, right?
Why wouldn't you do the same thing for the miracles of Satya Sai Baba? Now, he was obviously a charlatan.
And as soon as you're saying some, you can say two.
All of Jerusalem were like, is Jesus really the Son of God? When Paul first appeared on Deep Drink's podcast, he opened up about his personal journey of leaving behind a fundamentalist young earth creationist worldview, a belief that the earth is only a few thousand years old. Surprising to me, who grew up in a young earth creationist church, the young earth creationist view is not the dominant one within Christianity. However, what is almost unanimous amongst the 45,000 denominations of Christianity is the view that Jesus literally and physically died and after 3 days was resurrected. A famous thought has become, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. Here to discuss the resurrection and the can of worms that surrounds that subject is Paul Enns from Paulogia. Welcome to Deep Drink's podcast.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be here and in my evening and your morning, and wherever it is that other people are watching. It's going to be at a different time. So
thank you so much for coming on, man. So I mentioned to you before we started that I'm going through a little bit of a mental health journey at the moment. Got a bit of anxiety going on, so I'm actually pumping the brakes on the alcohol. Just I don't find it super helpful when I'm dealing with that kind of stuff. So what are you drinking today?
I am drinking, and this is special for your show. I normally wouldn't on a talk show, but yeah, I broke out my Black Barrel tequila, which I normally do for my Toast to Toast show. So I'm going to start with that.
Awesome.
It's a little early in the day for me, but this is great. I love it. And
how early is it for you?
I mean, it's only 7:00, but normally I wouldn't start drinking. Normally I wouldn't start drinking quite this early in the evening. And I'm now switching to my classic trusty rum and coke because I need a little caffeine still.
Yeah.
So we're sticking with that, and with my local Nova Scotia rum boat rum, which is delicious from Ironworks. If you're ever in the Nova Scotia area, it's great.
Oh, awesome! Wow, that's that. You should get sponsored by them. That's cool.
I would love to. That's my goal.
I need to get sponsored by some drinks. I tell you what, I give so much promotion, but yeah. So for me, it's 8:00 in the morning, and normally I would join you with the tequila shots. I love the tequila. I've actually got it back there, and I was ready for hopefully the next time you came on Deep Drinks to do it again. But today I've decided on a hot chocolate.
Oh, very nice.
Like life's too short. Let's go. Caffeine. I wasn't even going to do caffeine. I'm just like, let's get a hot chocolate. It's winter over here. Life's too short. Let's enjoy
Exactly.
it. You know what I mean?
I confess, I also brought a backup coffee just in case. So
nice.
In case I was getting a little silly, I thought I could back off. So
yeah, that's good. You need to have a bit of a rotation. It's great. So something I've noticed is over the years, your content seemed to have has been developing from less young earth creationist to more like scholarly subjects. I have to ask, like, just as we get started, is who is friendlier with the hate mail? Is it the young earth creationists, like kind of Ken Ham folks, or is it the scholarly folks that send you hate mail?
Who is friendlier with it? You know what? I would have to say that the young earth creationists are friendly, because I think a greater percentage of them just straight up go with, I'm going to pray for you.
Oh, yeah.
Because they are actually, they don't, a lot of younger creationists, I think, acknowledge that they are taking it on the Bible authority, as opposed to that they were reasoned into it or that they have great intellectual reason to do so. They're just trusting an authority, and they want you to trust that same authority. I feel like with some of the more intellectual topics that it stings a little bit harder, maybe. Or young earth creationists also kind of feel like I'm just deluded and have been brainwashed, perhaps, right, by secular society and this evolution. So, I mean, I have had great conversations from all manner of Christian. So and I've also had terrible conversations with all manner of Christians. So I don't mean to besmirch anyone. And actually, I think I'm sure we'll get into it. There's no one position that actually represents every Christian in any sense. Even this resurrection of the dead, as we'll see, there's different flavors of all
Mm.
that even as well. So, but no, you're right. I have done a bit of a shift on my channel. The New Testament study was always more of a passion of mine. It's just that the science led me down that path. So yeah, it's been weird, this whole YouTube life.
So I was talking to a I was talking to a friend the other night, and I realized, because they didn't grow up in church or in the context of, Christianity and that perspective, they Islam and Christianity are just as curious and strange to them as each other. Like they know nothing. I had to explain
Right.
things like who was like Jesus, like why he died and was resurrected, like the sin sacrifice. I had to explain all of it, and it was really like interesting to them, because like, oh, okay, so this is what Christians believe. So I thought what we could do is, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to have a conversation with you just briefly about Jesus, the story, like why we have Jesus, and then I'm going to ask you the who, what, when, and why, like how we know these things, like how we can piece it together. And then we can kind of move on to talking about the substance of your minimal witnesses hypothesis. Minimal witnesses, did I say that right? Minimal witnesses hypothesis.
Yeah, that is what I've been calling it now, which I hope
Yeah,
the catchy title I was going for. So yeah.
yeah, it's good. It's good. So I wanted to see if you could give us just a breakdown of like, okay, let's say I don't know anything about who is this Jesus person. Explain to me like the concept all the way back from like just generally from like the Abrahamic covenant, or like who the people of Israel were, the
Right.
Israelites, all the way up into the current Christianity.
Well, I think if you, I'm so now I should have got myself a Jesus hat to put on here, but the of course it would start with there was a creator of the there was a creator of the universe. We need to explain why there is something rather than nothing. And when we look at the earth, we look at the trees, and we see that had to have been designed, and that creator of the universe who created the universe in 7 days, be they metaphorical or literal, and that creator created the world specially for us, and that creator wants to have a relationship with us. Now, that creator is all powerful, all knowing, all omnipresent. Omnibenevolent is a debatable, but he does love us. The Bible shows that he loves us, wants to be in a relationship with us. But unfortunately for us, that God is also just, that he is holy. He's perfectly holy and cannot abide being with anything. He cannot, his nature is such that sin, which is the gap between what God wants us to do and what we actually do, that can't stand in his all holy. Now, because man is fallen, I think everyone, now I'm talking as a Christian right now. You would,
Yeah. So first of all, I love your beagle running back and forth. That's
yes,
let's get a counter. People could count it in the stream, but it's really cute. We have a beagle as well, but yeah, I want to like kind of look at this from a Christian perspective, as if me and you are like a knock knock, hi, let's tell you about Jesus, our Lord and Savior, and we just give someone a breakdown. So go as Christian as you want. In fact, get into
right,
pray in tongues if you need to. No, but
absolutely. Well, I'm practicing back to my four spiritual laws. We'll see how all this goes. But the so because there's sin, and sin was introduced by Adam, the first man, and his wife Eve, and therefore we've all inherited what is this sin nature from them. We are basically incapable of living a perfect life the way God needs us to in order to be with Him. So that went on for several thousand years. At one point, God decided that He wanted to enact a salvation plan, and part of that plan was raising up a group of people to demonstrate to the rest of the world that there were laws and that there were people that were closer to God than others, and that happened to be Abraham and the Jewish nation, according to the Bible. at least. Islam, I think, would just they would agree with the Abraham part and maybe not with all the other branches. But from Abraham came, this Jewish people, and from the Jewish people, God had always planned. If you are a Christian, you'd believe that the plan was always to from that God knew that wouldn't work. And we have the bump of the flood, for example. We had to kill everybody once, and that's all fine.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
So just to sorry to interject.
yeah,
Just to well, just to interject, but so is the idea, and because we kind of grew up in two different kind of styles of Christianity. You were very much I forgot the name of it. It was close to Amish, there wasn't it? It was
Mennonite community,
Mennonite.
tradition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was in that direction where I was more in the direction of preachers and sneakers, kind of
Mhm.
Christianity. And but so from my understanding, what I learned in ministry college is God was uh, we had broken the laws, or broken the one command that we had in the Garden of Eden. So when I say we, I mean Adam, humanity.
Yep.
Adam and Eve did. They were kicked out of the garden, and then but God was so gracious that He was doing things to try and make it so we could redeem ourselves. So He killed all the evil people and all the evil animals, everything on Earth except for Noah and his magical zoo boat. He created things like, well, if you've done some sin, you can kill this animal and use its blood as a kind of redeeming quality, or burn it on an altar, and that can forgive your sin. This is where it gets a bit blurry for me, but we just
Mm.
kept getting it wrong, right? We just
Well,
couldn't.
so, and from my tradition, we would have acknowledged that none of those God was never under the delusion that any of those were going to work either for the
Ah.
human side or be sufficient. But these were all to prepare us. They're basically preparing humanity as a culture. So, for example, we needed to understand the notion that sacrifice can atone for sin, right? So we needed that those 1,000 years of doing sacrifices to atone for our little sins, even though they were insufficient, so that we would be familiar enough with the concept that Jesus' sacrifice could atone.
Mm, mm,
Now, uh, I didn't live under the old covenant. I was just introduced to the new one. I don't think people got significantly smarter over the last 6,000 years. Evolution happens, but I don't think we're that far ahead. I feel like people might have just caught on if you just brought Jesus onto the scene and said, "Hey, you know what? This is going to pay the cost, pay the bill." I don't know that we needed all the sacrificing, but who am I?
mm.
I'm not God. I don't know the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, but anyway, and it's interesting that yeah, you thought so in your tradition, these sacrifices, if they had been adhered to, would have
Yeah.
worked.
Well, I guess it was a way of, well, the way I understood it anyway, and maybe I was wrong, but it was a way of getting right with God. Because something needed there was a sacrifice you had to make, uh, to kind of, I guess, make things right. I guess. So because
Well, the there's the this whole Hebrews 11 chapter, which is the chapter in the New Testament that summarizes the Old Testament, right? It's a by faith chapter, and it says by faith Abraham did this, by faith Noah did this. It lists them all off, and it tells us, why these men were mostly men were in God's sight, right? We're justified, even though none of us can be justified by that now. So I think there is scriptural um, basis for your interpretation there that you could say, you know what, Hebrews 11 says that by faith Abraham was faithful in the tasks he was given, so he's going to be saved even though Jesus didn't exist in it. So um, valid interpretation, I would say.
So yeah, and for the story, people who don't understand the story of Abraham, he's like the father of, well, he's a probably mythological or at least legendary figure, that Islam calls back to, Judaism calls back to, and Christianity calls back to. He had a vision not a vision, but God spoke to him and said that his offspring will outnumber the stars in the sky. I calculated that number, and it would be impossible for it to happen on Earth because the sun will burn out before that happened. So then you have to think, well, maybe it was poetic, or maybe it was just the ones you could see, and so it gets more complicated. I took things a little too literally, maybe. But
I went for that last one that you have to go by what they didn't in their day. They didn't know about the stars; they couldn't see. So
yeah,
anyway, fair enough.
yeah, and which begs the question, why were they there? But anyway, but he heard this. I won't say, or try not to say things like voice in his head, but he heard that God told him to go sacrifice his son, and so he brought Isaac. Muslims believe that it was Ishmael, and Ishmael knew it was happening, but Christianity and Judaism believe it was Isaac. Brought him up to the mountain to slit his throat and burn him on an altar. And just as he's about to do it, an angel came down and said, "Hey, don't do that. Kill this lamb instead that was stuck in a bush." And he did that and saved Isaac's life. I imagine the walk back, by the way, if this is a true story, the walk back, Isaac would have been like, "What the fuck?" Like, you know what I mean? Like, what the hell was that? Like, you know what I mean? So and of course, so then we get all the way up to Jesus, and Jesus is supposed to be that lamb, that last lamb that was slaughtered.
Right.
We no longer need to do it because he is the lamb that was slaughtered on behalf of the sins of everyone before that, and on behalf of the sins of everyone after that. So I guess, well, let me ask you this, and this is kind of contested, but who was Jesus? Was he a man? Was he God's son? What do you understand from a Christian perspective of who Jesus
right.
was?
I feel like the Orthodox Christianity position is that he was fully God and fully man, even though our brains can't reconcile those two things.
Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Just like on our side, Donald Trump can't understand, someone could be of a mixed race. We can't understand how one can be fully one thing and fully another, right? So,
so what is it? Is Kamala Harris?
It has to be
to stay on topic, on trend. Kamala Harris is it because she's got Indian?
She's and I don't know if it's half and half, but let's say for our discussion, it's half and half. So she's half Jamaican, Black African descent, and half Indian descent.
So she's fully both, is what the idea of Jesus.
And that in the Christian view, you would say she's fully both.
Okay, all right.
Which doesn't comport really. We can't. But that's part of the mystery, right? So God moves in mysterious ways. You have to accept. And I actually, when I was a Christian, I got that we as limited creatures, that there would have to be things about God that we can't understand. Just like my dog who's running back and forth doesn't understand that I'm talking to someone from a different continent right now.
Yeah.
I could never explain that to her. In the same way, we as humans, there's certain things God could never explain to us due to our limitations. So I didn't personally have a problem with that. But it does have to be both, because if you're not fully God, then you are just one person paying for one person, right? So it's just a one for one. And you also, because of our sin nature, it would be impossible to live a sinless life that would be required. Because apparently, and again, this is, God gave himself a bill for sin. God set the price. We don't have anything involvement. We don't understand. Now, as an atheist, I don't get, you're setting the price. You could set the price to anything you want. But anyway, in the Christian lore, you'd have to be fully God, fully man. If you're not fully man, you couldn't die, right? You couldn't take on that thing, and you couldn't. Part of it is that apparently that Jesus understands where our problems because he was one of us in that unique way. So, but yes, fully God, fully man. When he died, there's different models of atonement, but generally people accept that whatever the general notion of whatever the price was, that that was paid at the cross, and then when Jesus resurrected 3 days later, that was overcoming death. That was letting us So there's in the Garden of Eden, there was the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Again, Jesus kind of brings both back, right? So he got rid of the sin and then got rid of the death punishment for sin by resurrecting. So
Mm.
that's in a that's the
Yeah.
problem to be solved, right, in Christianity. Now, if you
Such
don't
good
believe in
news.
God, sin doesn't make any sense, because if you define sin as not bad things or evil things, but as the Bible defines sin, it's the gap between what God wants and what we do. Well, there can't be a gap there if God doesn't exist and doesn't want things, right?
Mm.
Then we're just down to evaluating ethics, or evaluating more, harm, or evaluating benefits
Yeah.
versus any kind of sin notion. So I find that is actually hard for Christians to understand, is that there is no problem of sin to be solved if you don't buy into the first narrative.
Mm.
Like, this is very much uh, giving someone the disease and then selling them the cure.
Mm. Created sick, commanded to be sound is the
Right,
folk rebel poem.
right.
Mm.
I don't know if that was brief enough. That's one tequila shot worth of
No, that's good.
the
It
story
is
of
good, but
Christianity.
it's and of course there's so many questions about like what did people where did people go when they died before Jesus, and then there's a lot of like, or what happens when we die even after Jesus. A lot of people seem to have this idea of heaven and hell and things like that, but it's actually considerably more ambiguous than you
For
may
sure.
hope for a book that's supposed
Eschatology is
to have.
yeah, the end times, the views are tough. I don't know where you sat on all this kind of stuff. When I was in Bible college, I definitely was studying end times and looking at that kind of stuff. And it sure seems like, we're looking for a new heaven and a new earth, in that we're not going to heaven, we're all coming back here with new
Mm,
bodies, right? Like, so this whole notion of heaven actually
yeah,
isn't super biblical, right? It's know that God's coming to restore either this earth or give us a new one.
yeah. What
Um,
what what I what blew my mind about, because I only really understood that, I think it was after I deconstructed, but it was when I started reading what, it might have been one of Bart Ehrman's books, or it might have been one of the other. It was someone who's come on Deep Drinks before. Obviously not Bart Ehrman, but it might have been someone who came on to Deep Drinks before. And they explained the kind of concept. But the best way I like to describe it is like, the new heaven and the new earth. It's like when Jesus comes into his kingdom, it's Jerusalem. It'll be like his kingdom and everything. I like to think like, well, I could drive my car there. Like I could get it on a ferry and
mhm.
drive it over. Like to think of it like that, and that's the heaven or that's the new earth or the new. I go, whoa! Like I go, that's totally separate. That's totally different to what I had in mind when I thought of heaven. When I thought of heaven, I was actually a little bit confused because I didn't understand how it could be enjoyable to be singing holy, 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 or just holy over and over again to God, or I didn't. I don't even think that if you were to press me as a Christian back then, I go like, so what is heaven like? Like, what is do we see our relatives? So is it are we in new body? Can we recognize people? Do we have desires that we don't fulfill, or are we just completely void of any evil desire? Like, what uh, you know um, I guess what makes me part of what makes me who I am is the fact that I can have a desire to do something that isn't helpful to my flourishing and choose not to. You know what I mean? Like I can, you know, make good decisions. Where if you don't have the option to make good decisions, are you really you? Like, well, who are you? Like, you just a shell of,
Right.
what I mean? You have no option but to do good. So do you really have what makes you you? I don't. It becomes very confusing and very I wouldn't have liked to talk about it, I think, as a Christian, because I just wouldn't know what. I don't think there's an answer. Well, what about you in the Mennonite community? What was?
Well, no, and absolutely. Like, we actually, I think, did adopt more of the language of the new heaven and new earth, a little bit more than the you know than the in the clouds kind of thing. But obviously, one of the one of the hymns, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, there's no less days to see God's grace than when we first begun, was a big one. There was like that. This definitely living forever is part of it, even if it's going to be, more material, like roads paved with gold, mansions, kind of thing. Um, but so you talked a little about your so some people know, not everyone knows, but I am a cancer survivor, and I at one point was given very little time to live. Now I'm fine. I'm clear of all that now, but at one point in my life, I very much wasn't, and I really came. That really had me come to terms with this fear of death thing. I actually really don't fear death at all.
Whoa.
But what I do fear, because a lot of times I was going through treatments that I felt were even worse than the disease, right? My biggest fear is being forced to be alive when I don't want to be. That's the thing I fear the most. Like, so, that I will become sick or incapacitated, just like in some way I'll want to stop existing, and I have to keep existing. And that makes heaven or hell, doesn't matter which. If I don't have the ability to opt out when I'm done, like that's horrific to me. Like, I would, sure, you want to tell me, hey, you're gonna love heaven for 6 million years. Great, awesome, but that's not forever, right? I was out for 6 million years. I did all the things, and then wait, I still have no fewer days left than when I started. If we can't opt out of this heaven or hell situation, and that for me, that's terrible.
And this is where a lot of Christians will say things like, we have to trust God's got to, everything works out for good, and God's got a plan, or just the kind of, to deal with those anxieties, you would say things like that. I really agree and like what Michael Jones says when he made a video about the Trinity. He said, is it beyond our comprehension? And he goes, yes, it is. And he goes, we have to accept that it is beyond our comprehension. And I was like, well, that's exactly the problem, is it is beyond our comprehension. And I think just a lot of these problems my old pastor used to say to me when I'd have like a question that was too hard for him to answer, he'd go, well, we can ask him when we meet him. And it's just like, well, great, like that doesn't, what a non-answer.
I also comedically sometimes, like, what's the lineup for Jesus going to look like? Can he be talking to all of us? Is it one question? You get your one question, you get back in line. I don't know. Like, we all want to ask them questions.
Yeah.
Lots of people want to. I want to ask St. Peter this or Moses that. I'm like, they want to talk to Jesus. They don't want to talk to you. Who are you? Like, it's going to be it's a whole thing.
Or like, is Jesus even at heaven yet? I said this to Michael O'Connor. I was like, Dr. Michael O'Connor. I was like, if he's lifted up into the clouds and he's like on his way to heaven when he disappeared into the clouds, unless he like sped up to faster than the speed of light, or he just disappeared and then reappeared in heaven, which doesn't really make sense why he would then lift up. Like, why couldn't he just done that on Earth? He's still traveling because we can see 13 billion light years away, so he's still like, unless he's going faster than the speed of light, he's still traveling on his way to heaven, unless heaven is like invisible and closer, like maybe heaven's in our solar system and it's like
so that's a good question. So light that left 2,000 years ago, would we still see? Because he'd be departing. Yeah, there's someone who's better than me at physics would be able to tell me whether we'd still be able to see.
Oh yeah, we could see. He might be redshifted because he's going away. Maybe, like, I'm sure we could.
I feel like it's one of those things. I feel like it's just a sort of a stage left, exiting the stage kind of a situation. It's like once they couldn't see him anymore, then Jesus was in backstage part of the universe, and he could take off his costume and and do whatever it is he needed to. And
it's possible
get an Uber to heaven.
It's possible that when Jesus was flying past Jupiter, that he did drop a teapot, and it is actually in orbit around Jupiter. Like, we don't know. It's possible. We don't know. We haven't tested.
The Gospels did not record whether Jesus had a teapot when he left or not.
That's true. So So before we so we got the Jesus story now. Okay, so I guess we don't have to spend too much time on this, but how do we know this? So if I'm if I'm someone and go like, how do we know any of this stuff? How do we know this history? Who wrote this down? Who were the authors? Who wrote it down? When did they write it down? Do you have like a general, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, well, not I shouldn't say this isn't obvious because it's not obvious to people. We don't get Christianity from the New Testament because there were decades of Christians. So Jesus died in 30, 33, somewhere around there. Um, the New Testament, even the people who date it the earliest, they might date Mark around 50 AD. I date it more like 70 AD, but doesn't matter. We're talking about either 2 decades or 4 decades at that point. There were 2 decades at least, or maybe four or more, of Christians who had no access to anything written down at all. So Christianity didn't actually come from a book. Christianity came from the stories that were told in that 20 to 40 years. Now, one can imagine that, well, Christians like to imagine that these stories were perfectly told, um, and perfectly memorized. And when you heard it, every time you heard it from your neighbor and you became a Christian, you remembered exactly what they said because they remembered exactly what an apostle said or something. And that these stories that were circulating were done so perfectly. I think that's rather naive. I think that we can all attest that when we are trying to convince someone of a position, and you can imagine in that first century, there was probably the first converts were Jews. So you were trying to convince your neighbor that this Jesus, whom they've never met and could never see, but they may have heard died on a cross, that person was the Messiah, and that person, died for your sins, and whatever the early proto orthodoxy was. And I don't think all this came into fruition right away. So we have these decades of this oral tradition, and even Bible scholars will point to certain things that they see in the New Testament, and they say, you know what, that probably came from the oral tradition because either it's set up in kind of like a rhyming structure, so it looks like it was maybe a creed or something like that, and or the person literally says, "Oh, as I told you, decades ago," or whatever. So it wasn't actually who wrote it down first that I think is the most important. The most important stuff happened in those first couple decades between when Jesus died and when people started writing it down. Now, the first person to start writing things down that we still have today is Paul.
Mm.
Pretty much no one says that the Gospels were written before Paul's letters. Now, there are 13 letters in the New Testament that have Paul's name on them, but most scholars would say that 7 for sure were written by Paul, and there's 6 that are disputable. Though, hello, Chrissy Hansen, if you're watching. Chrissy thinks that it's Philemon doesn't count and has a new book, and I can't wait to read that book to find out why Philemon shouldn't count. All that said, Paul's letters were first. Paul says virtually nothing about Jesus' life. He records that he died, was buried, and was resurrected. And buried, important in the word Paul uses, ataphi in Greek, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I'm not a ancient Greek speaker. Doesn't mean fancy tomb; it just means body discarded of, right? Body was dealt with, and that Jesus Paul was seen to be aware of a Last Supper tradition. Other than that, Paul didn't care about Jesus' life. He says he had a vision. He says he received everything directly. He had a direct line with God, and God just told him stuff direct. So he didn't need all that, other stuff. Fast forward, I would say 20 years later, but however many years later is when Mark was written,
Mark's
and
our earliest gospel.
Mark was the first gospel written. It seems pretty evident from the synoptic problem. Very briefly, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are incredibly, they share a lot of word for word and almost word for word verbatim recording which seems to be impossible if you don't think that one was the source for the other, given that they were written in Greek. Everything Jesus said was in Aramaic and happened decades earlier. So Mike Lacone actually gives this example. Like, imagine if, we were all witnessing a crime that was happening in Spanish, and then 20 years later, you got together 3 English speakers and said, well, tell us what happened, but don't use the Spanish. Tell us in English what happened. And we all came up with, like, exactly word for word the same translation 20 years later, or something that happened in a different language. You'd be like, well, that's a little weird, because translation in and of itself is imprecise, right? So anyway, it seems pretty clear, and you could do a whole show on why Mark and priority doesn't matter. Mark was written probably first. Then it seems like
when do you think Mark was written? Sorry,
I think Mark was written in shortly after 70 AD. So 70 AD is the big marker when Rome finally got fed up with Israel, and they sacked Jerusalem. It was a 4-year war. They destroyed the temple. Up until modern era, that was basically when the last time Israel existed, right? Up until in the 60s when it got reinstated. A lot of people like myself think that it was written afterwards, is because there seems to be allusions to that war, and there seems to be, like, all the Gospels talk about that war in a way that they expect. Not even so much that it's prophetic; they seem to expect that their reader is already aware that happened, and so that's why most scholars put Mark around 70, maybe Matthew and Luke in 80 and 90, and probably John 90 to 100, somewhere in there.
And it's important to note too that this isn't like we have these texts. We don't have like Bart Ehrman loves to say, we don't have copies of copies of copies. Like we don't have the originals. I think what is the earliest we have is P52, and it's like a credit card size piece from John. I think it is.
That's my recollection as well.
Yeah, and I think that was 150. CE. So you're talking, over 120 years after the events that it's trying to retell.
Now, I'm a little different than some people. I'm actually not as concerned that we don't have what the originals say. We know that there was some textual corruption. For example, we know that someone stuck some extra verses at the end of Mark because they didn't like the way it ended. We know that the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, that got actually inserted into a couple different points. So we got one. Some scribes put it into Luke, some scribes put it into John. Just from various textual criticism, we know that story is not unique. What we don't know is how many other times that happened. Sure, it probably happened. There were other textual changes. I tend to not think that that's super important. I tend to think that we know that, sure, people were monkeying with the texts. What I think is most important is what was happening to these stories before they got written down. Because it actually makes sense that once you start writing them down, that's when everyone can start to coalesce right around the same story. Because now we're getting, does everyone have their copy of Mark? And obviously Matthew would change some things, and Luke changed some things, but you know what you're basing it on. So, but yes, I think people like Bart Ehrman would definitely want to point out that we absolutely don't have those original copies. Doesn't bother me that much, but your mileage may vary.
It also makes sense that we don't have anything written down for 20, 30 years because, and this is something I go over in a video I've been working on for way too long that should be out will be out by the time this video is out. It's called Using the Bible to Fact Check Apologists. And one of the things I note is, we got the Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21 or 16, I think it is. The end times prophecies about, Jesus saying this generation will not pass away until you see the Son of Man.
The Olivet Discourse, yes,
yeah. And there's a lot of ways that people kind of sneakily try and get around that, and they'll translate words to mean different things. Forget about that. Forget about all of that. Just go read Paul. Paul's telling people, I tell you that that we who are still here in the last days, and the judge is at the door. we're reading letters from Paul to other Christian groups. We're eavesdropping. Scumbags. We shouldn't be reading someone else's mail, but we are. We're reading scumbag Christians, reading people's mail. No, but they're reading from the Church of Thessalonica, reading to the Church of Corinth, reading, and it's very clear that the early church at least thought that Jesus was coming back soon. There's no reason to write down these things. In no way can I imagine that Paul would think that we'd still be talking about these things 2,000 years later.
And that's actually one of the reasons why we can tell why we think that some of the 6 letters that probably Paul didn't write were written by them, because it's this dramatic shift of, like, First Thessalonians, definitely get ready because it's happening any minute. Second Thessalonians is, whoa, everybody chill out. There needs to be all these prophetic things that got to happen first, so don't worry. And how about if we start organizing into bishops and things, and let's start having rules about taking care of widows, versus like original Paul, which is like, forget the widows, forget this all. Don't even take a cloak with you.
Yeah. It's happening, baby. It's happening now.
Don't have kids. That's stupid. We're going. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I came to the realization that, like, shouldn't someone, when in my church, when someone got engaged, it was a big celebration. When we got engaged, my brother-in-law put a video together, and we showed it in church. Everyone was clapping. It was a beautiful, like, amazing. Everyone was congratulatory. We're getting engaged. It was beautiful. Where under the Christian worldview, shouldn't that be like you couldn't do it, you should have held off for the sake of the kingdom, but you gave into temptation? Like, shouldn't it be a negative thing? Like, now your responsibility lies with your family, not just the church. Like, I couldn't believe it when I kind of realized what the text was actually saying there. Like, it's better not to get married.
Well, one of the things about the Bible is that you can, it's pliable enough that you can take virtually any position you want and find selective verses. So, we're commanded to be fruitful and multiply, right? Like that. And the whole Old Testament, literally, children are the blessing. When you are faithful, you are given children. That is the blessing that is God most often gives to people, other than land. You get land and kids, and maybe sex slaves if you're lucky. Apparently.
I shouldn't laugh at that, but luckily it probably didn't happen.
No, yes, exactly. So, and I actually used to play a game in my early days of doing this atheist YouTube thing. I would have people, write in on a Discord style thing and say, give me anything you want, any position, and I will find verses to defend it. To the extent of, well, hey, should you speed run this game, or should you peek at your Christmas presents? And I would be like constantly just like trying to proof text, and you can find a verse. It's long enough that you can, find some verse that at least vaguely lets you, whatever you want to believe. I feel like the Bible is pliable enough, that you can, which is why both people who held slaves and people who freed the slaves both thought that the Bible was on their side.
Yeah.
Right. And that seems like a pretty thing that a book should be unambiguous about.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. Inconsistencies.
So we know these things because of these authors and these oral traditions, and written in languages that weren't what Jesus was speaking in different locations, and we don't know who the authors are, do we? We don't know. So here's the thing. When Dr. Michael Kona came on, he believes that at least 3 of the gospel writers were the authors, or were the disciples, or were the attributed to the correct people. I think Mark, Luke, and.
Well, I have spent the last weekend actually reading Mike's new book. Dr. Lacona's brand new book is out, and I've been reading that this last week. He actually very much would back down from what you just said. He thinks that 3 of the books were talented literary composers who had access to the original, to the 3 people that they're named after.
Okay, maybe I'm getting that wrong. Maybe he was saying that the originals, that the originals were written by
I don't want to put words into his mouth, but
Yeah, yeah.
all I want to say is that Mike's position, which I feel like is actually much more defensible than the average person's position, because the Bible straight up calls, Peter and John unschooled, unlettered men who, illiterate people.
Mm.
John can't be writing whole books if he's illiterate, right?
Mm.
And so this thing. Um, anyway, the whole traditional attribution of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Luke and Mark obviously weren't eyewitnesses anyway, right? They don't even pretend to be.
Mm.
Mark is allegedly just writing down things that Peter told him much later. Mark never met Jesus. As far as we know, Luke never met. Even if you take Luke as Luke, the physician who is a traveling companion of Paul, which I don't. Paul didn't even meet Jesus, let alone like someone who learned from Paul.
Mm.
So, at least two of them definitely weren't eyewitnesses. And John and Matthew, it sure seems like the more learned the Christian, they would definitely say, those were people who were using Greek-speaking composers, and that perhaps there seems to be early church tradition of that, John was perhaps in a community of people and just telling his stories, and people were, scribbling down his stories. And that if Matthew wrote anything at all, he wrote it in Hebrew, and maybe that was a inspiration later for the person who eventually did write the Matthew that we know. But those wouldn't be the same book, right? Because what Matthew is said to have been writing was not a narrative, but just the utterances of Jesus. A list of utterances is not the same as the narrative that we have. So the early church traditions that are out there from Papias and others don't jive with the books that we're holding up. So whatever happened in all that process, and man, there's just so many theories on each side, even from people who want to say that the people whose name is on the book was involved. You have to be pretty evangelical at this point to say that no, John took a pen and parchment and put the letters down himself.
Yeah.
So
I was saying to Drew from Genetically Modified Skeptic, I was saying that I was watching a video where it was like some southern preacher, and he was saying that he uses the King James Bible to correct the Greek. Like he's like that level of like, you're like, whoa, this is some wild stuff, and
that's, yes, that absolutely has happened. But and then in my position would be that by Occam's razor, if we're already willing to say that the people who composed those 4 books were later Greek composers, then the whole idea that they had direct access to the eyewitnesses, by Occam's razor, we don't need that. We know they say they were using other sources, so we don't need, the Gospels we have in our hands can be explained without those authors having direct access. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but there's nothing about those books that requires them to have had it. And it sure seems like it complicates things. You have to jump through a bunch of hoops to put these people in the same time and place to make that work. So I think the much simpler hypothesis is that well-meaning, genuine Christians who probably weren't making stuff up out of thin air were writing down what the community kind of had settled on in their stories, but also because they were Greek composers, they were aware of Greek classics. They were aware of the Old Testament. They were aware of narrative devices. So they were also using some of those so that they could draw parallels between Moses, for example, and Jesus, so that they could also, make the same kind of narrative stories about Greek gods. That's how they learned to write about gods. So they're going to use some of those same narrative devices, and I don't
Mm.
think that should threaten anyone. Which is what, again, Mike Lacona's book is largely like Christians shouldn't feel threatened that Greek writers were using Greek composition devices.
Mm.
But what it does threaten, of course, is this idea that um, that if we had a camera, we could make our own version of The Chosen just by filming what was actually happening, right?
Mm.
And that you'd be able to, the words Jesus said on my time travel video camera are what's written in the Gospels. Uh, that would be threatened. So if you're
Mm.
that kind of Christian, what I've just said is threatening. But I feel like if you just are looking at this historically and narratively, it just makes sense.
Mm. I would say every Christian, it might not, there's actually probably some fringe groups, but every Christian believes in the resurrection. That's like the
Mm-hmm.
trope of that is Christianity, is believing that Jesus died and was resurrected after 3 days. So I actually love what Michael Jones kind of says. I think I'll paraphrase this, but resurrection theory is the best explanation. The resurrection theory best explains all the data without requiring multiple assumptions or implausible scenarios. So, regarding the resurrection, how much do you agree with a statement like that?
Well, I vastly disagree in that I feel like the resurrection is itself an implausible scenario, right? So
Mm.
if you are not already I don't profess that supernatural can't exist,
Mm-hmm.
but I do not have any evidence that has convinced me that it does.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if if I'm reading a story, and in that story is a virgin birth, or a character who claims to be the son of a god,
Mm-hmm.
be that Julius Caesar, be that Alexander the Great, or be that Jesus, I am at least taking those portions of that story and reducing my confidence because that is an implausible scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when what you're putting forth is an implausible, like if I was, boy, it sure would. The most parsimonious thing is that a dragon flew away with my car
Mm-hmm.
because I had my, I don't know, just no one steals cars around here. But this whole dragon thing that answers all the data. That's why the car disappeared. We never found it. And I'm like, well, there's lots of other things that could have happened to my car. Even if they don't seem super likely, um,
Mm.
I'm gonna prefer them to the dragon story.
Yeah.
So there is, I think, going to be some problems, in saying that is the preferred device, unless you are showing me specific, again, unless the evidence, unless the testimony is such that you were quoting Hume with Dr. Lacona when you were interviewing him.
Love you.
Unless the testimony is, it's more miraculous that it would be false than the actual miracle itself. So I'm with
Mm.
you. What we have is testimony.
Mm-hmm.
I've yet to find any Christian who's presented me anything that was outside the category of testimony. And we know that people can be mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
People are mistaken every day. I'm mistaken every day. Sincerely just wrong. And people also lie every day. We've all come across that every day. So super common for people to be mistaken, super common for people to be lying. So when you come to us with testimony from people we can't cross-examine, we're going to be saying, you know what? It's very common. Lying and mistaken has got to be more common than resurrections, especially since you're
Mm.
saying there's only been one resurrection across the billions of people who've been alive. Just statistically, lying has to be what we would lean towards. So I think that all the evidence that someone like Michael Jones would show me, I think it was Michael you were talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that quote, uh, is of the kind where I can say, no, I can imagine it that being mistaken is a better explanation.
It
So, and
is
that's what
interesting.
go ahead.
Well, I agree with you there. It is interesting that I think when I interviewed Testify Apologetics, Eric from Testify Apologetics on Deep Drinks, I brought up the cases of resurrections with Satya Sai Baba. And these are still
Mhm.
people. I think you can still interview some of them. I think they might still be alive today, or at least witnesses of these quote unquote resurrections or miracles today. There are testimonies of certain people in India being resurrected after the body starting to smell after 3 days. Um, so I just don't know if you can take one testimony, like say the testimony of Jesus, and go, this is true. Why wouldn't you do the same thing for the miracles of Satya Sai Baba? Now, he was obviously a charlatan. Like, I think when he died, he predicted that he would return back to life, I think in 1989, or maybe he died in 1989. He predicted he'd come back. He didn't come back. But when they, and he was famous for things like, making gold appear in his hands, and or giving people, or like making watches appear in his hands and giving them to people. But when he died, they found like a bunch of like watches in his like he'd bought them and he was using them to. But again, I don't know if he was professing them to be miracles, or if he was just doing like sneaky, like how yogis can kind of be a little bit humorous and funny, and he was just doing sleight of hand kind of stuff for people. So
Right.
who knows? But there was millions of people who followed this guy Satya Sai Baba, and there is lots of testimony that you can read online about people who witnessed their loved ones being resurrected, and they sound very convincing, or at least very. I think there's one. I think it's I forgot I'm not going to try and pronounce the name, but Satya comes in and he goes, "Oh, get out of here! Women, you're why are you bothered? Kind of thing." And they like leave the room, and they come back in, and after like 3 days, this guy's sitting on the bed, and he's like, go talk to your family. They're worried about you. Like he's been resurrected, and he no longer smells of death. And he goes, and it's just so similar to how like some of the stories of Jesus are portrayed, where Jesus comes and like settles the storm. Everyone's panicking, and it's just like, get out of here, don't panic. Like let's do the miracle resurrection healing thing, and then let's move on. And it's just and I just think, if you're going to accept one, why can't you accept the other accounts of resurrections around the world, or
Which is
other?
one thing I appreciate about Dale Allison. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Dale. Um, he's a Christian scholar, and he has a great resurrection, probably my favorite resurrection book of all. Um, but he literally says, we as Christians, if we're accepting this, like, and he has a whole chapter on something called rainbow bodies, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but
No.
these miracle claims out of Hindu cultures, and where he's like, boy, it sure seems like, and he runs through the evidence that they have for some of their miracles. He's like, it sure seems like it's on par with the evidence that I've presented for the resurrection here. So I don't know what to do with that.
I
Right. And,
love when Christians are honest like that. I love it.
yeah,
I really. That's why I appreciate Mike a little bit, because, and because I think he does that a lot better than. I mean, the bar's so low, I have to say, but
I don't know, but he gave me 0%, so I don't know if I can.
that's right. he did.
Even
We
though
did
I'm
speak.
enjoying his new book, I don't know. He slandered me.
He did say that. He did say that. It's funny too, because Dr. Kip Davis said that he gives 0% chance that any of the gospel writers were the actual authors, were the actual disciples, or any, like, it
Mm,
was, yeah. And I was like, and Mike didn't like that as well. So let me just quickly share the screen. So you've got your minimal witnesses hypothesis,
right.
naturalistic hypothesis. I say that 5 times fast. And so could you just run us through each one of these points?
So before
And
I do that,
yeah.
I want to give so I do run the 12 points are important, but I do want to just give I realize when I present it, now that I've had a few people discussing it, including yourself, um, it actually needs a bit of a preamble.
Hmm.
I feel like, so the brief preamble is that the minimal hypothesis is that we can explain all of the hard data we have for the origin of Christianity with a minimal number of witnesses, only two. I feel like we only need two, that we can explain it with just Peter having seen a grief hallucination, and then Paul following up, because we have so much documentation of Paul. And really, that's the extent of it, is that there's none of the data that someone like a Gary Habermas or Mike Licona throws at us demolishes the notion that that could be achieved with just the two witnesses. And so that's the umbrella, as it were, through which the rest of these are. That's what the rest of these are meant to support. So it'd be, I feel like giving the 12 points without the opening statement, maybe people don't understand what these are intended to support. So
yeah, and just to even like circle it back further, this is kind of, this is, I guess, a natural explanation for why, because we both agree that, I assume we both agree that, it's almost unanimous that Jesus existed in the scholarship. It's almost unanimous that he was crucified. And this is what, well, I think in Michael Jones's video, he says that the empty tomb has wide support amongst the scholarship.
I would definitely fight about that. It has wide support among people who believe that Jesus resurrected. And there's a reason why someone like Gary Habermas in his latest, book, which is the latest, greatest 1,000-page book, can't include empty tomb as one of his facts, because it does not have enough support from non-believing scholars. So it's literally not a fact to be explained.
Okay, well, I actually have a question about this book, because this is the tome that you picked up before that. It's one of three, right? That the other two aren't released yet? One of four.
So this is part 1, 1,000 pages. The next one comes out September, so I'm anxiously looking forward to that. This one is supposed to be the evidence for Gary's case for his minimal facts. Book 2 is supposed to be, so it basically deals with no opposition to his facts. It's just presenting his case straight up. Book 2 is supposed to be dealing with objections. Book 3 is supposed to be the hard data that he used. So he's been studying this for 40, whatever it is, years, and keeps alluding to this body of data that he has.
Yeah.
But he's problematically never published this data. So when he pulls out a number out of thin air saying like 71% of scholars believe X.
Yeah.
None of us can check that because we don't know who he's surveyed. So anyway, book 3 is supposed to be that hard data. So that's probably not going to sell super well. I'm going to love it, but it's probably not going to be flying off the shelves. And then book 4 is supposed to be his personal musings about what resurrection means to him and what it should maybe mean to people.
Yeah. Okay.
So more like it's not hard data at that point. It's, the soft side of it. Anyway, so there's 4 books. This is volume 1, and his minimal facts approach is supposed to set out 6 pieces of data that have to be explained by any naturalistic hypothesis. Now, I feel like I have fully adequately done that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So I have to ask, do you think that this book is a good faith investigation into the matter, or do you think it's just a tool for apologetics, like an apologetics piece of literature, or somewhere?
How do I say? I never want to impugn motive. Yeah. I don't want to impugn motive, right? So I do think that this was done. I do think that Gary thinks he's doing good scholarship. Now, Lydia McGrew, for example, has written some scathing articles. Lydia McGrew, for those who don't know, is she's not a Bible scholar, but she is a very intelligent woman with a PhD in something unrelated to the field, who writes a lot of stuff about Christianity. Very bright person. Anyway, but Christian beyond, like, she doesn't think Michael Icona is a Christian. She's like just that far.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. She has attacked Gary on his methodology. Like there's a lot of methodology. I've written a few articles, some of which are coming up to be on possibly Bart Ehrman's blog. Again, looking at his methodology, I went through the times where he quoted Bart Ehrman, which is many, many times. He quotes Bart more than anyone else. And he's just straight up, in my view, quote mining and or misrepresenting Bart. Like he's putting things in. And I've noticed that other scholars that I'm reading more and more who are writing about this book are just in whatever their corner of expertise is, they're noticing that Gary is not being very rigorous with representing what he's presenting well.
Mhm.
I don't think he's doing that deliberately to lie. Other people have noticed that there are very few sources in his book that are newer than like 12 to 14 years old. That Gary's book literally could have come out in 2010,
Mhm.
and that that and it would have been virtually unchanged, and that in the last 14 years, new things have been learned and new skill. That it isn't quite keeping up with that. So what should I say? Uh, I don't think this is as academically rigorous as he presents it. Academics don't seem to think that it's academically rigorous. It is definitely intended for someone who already agrees with him. He's not shy about that either. That it is meant to bolster a current believer as opposed to convince a skeptic. So I don't know if that answers the question. I've now
No, that
forgotten
does
what the
answer.
question was.
That does answer the question. Okay, so this is a hypothesis that that you say best not well. Would you say best, or would you say at least explains? It's another alternative.
I think it is. I think it is the. There are other naturalistic hypotheses which are interesting. I prefer mine for obvious reasons, partly because it jives with some of the secondary data that I think are defensible.
Mhm.
But it absolutely is a naturalistic hypothesis that answers it without being ad hoc and without
Mhm.
straining and without multiplying entities, right? Without multiplying solutions. So I think that my subtitle of my video on this is how Christianity probably began. I do believe that however Christianity began, it is probably something like what I described, but your
Okay.
mileage may vary. If
Awesome.
you
All
want to
right.
think that, for example, that Paul didn't exist and that, people were straight up making it up, um, you can
Yeah.
do it that, so anyway, let's carry on. These are basically, as we mentioned, it's kind of a cumulative case situation, in that I feel like these need to be laid out to preemptively answer objections. So number one, um, in the early first century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know to what extent you want me to elaborate on each of these.
Well, maybe I'll just ask questions, but that's pretty for each one. But I think that's pretty like everyone accepts that, right? Even John the Baptist was an apocalyptic.
Yeah. Anyway, they're accepted. They should
Yeah.
be well accepted. Non-controversial is what the word I'm looking for. Yes.
Okay.
My deep drinks are kicking in, David.
That's great. Number two.
So this Jesus said or did controversial things, which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time.
Again, no one disagrees with that.
Some
Wow.
Christians attack me for not being more specific about what he did, which I think that's just a weird hill to die on. Can't we just agree? We're all agreeing that he did weird stuff and died for it. Like, can we?
It is weird. It is weird because, yeah, because I don't think that matters at all, right? Like it's like he did something worthy of crucifixion. That was the point.
Right, and I don't think we have enough information, because the only information we have about what those charges were the Gospels, and I guess that's the other critique I often get is, well, this contradicts with the Gospels, and I'm like, well, the Gospels aren't a fact. We're not trying to explain every detail in the Gospels. We're not trying to come up with a natural, like for someone who says, well, Jesus walked on water because he knew where the stones were. Right? Well, no, I'm not trying to explain how Jesus walked on water. I'm trying to
That's
say that
great.
was just the story.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So
that's great.
anyway.
So
So
number
number
three.
3, the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers. Now this
Okay,
one
so
is highly controversial.
yeah, okay, explain that. So because I thought that it was known.
A lot of people want to fight about whether or not Jews were whether the gospel narrative is plausible, and
Mhm.
the way it's is it plausible that Joseph of Arimathea took the body and buried it as was said. Now, We're not talking about plausible. I'm talking about what's most likely happened. And so we know a lot about the first century. We wish we knew more, but we know a lot. Now there's several scenarios about what would have happened. Four basically. Either the Romans would have taken care of his body.
Mm-hmm.
Next, the family and friends would have taken care of his body. That's the second scenario. The Sanhedrin, so the religious leaders would have taken care of his body. Or we've got this fourth scenario that the Christians are talking about, that is, a rich, influential, powerful person took him in. Mm-hmm. So by far the most common thing was that the Romans dealt with it. Now, Christians want to say that in Judea, well, no, the Romans dealt with it by leaving it on the cross. That's there's lots and lots of citations. The hanging up there naked for days was supposed to be part of the punishment. Like that was part of what it was designed to do, was the warning. So if it was up to the Romans, that's what they did. There's definitely very good historical advice when the Romans were involved at the end. What they did was they either just let the dogs and crows eat the bodies, or they would throw it into a mass grave. So I'm not saying that's what happened. John Dominic Crossan wants to say that's definitely what happened. But what you can't argue is that isn't what happened to most of the people, because most crucifixion victims, that's what happened. So again, if we're getting into this, what probably happened, that's actually probably what happened. But fine, we'll go with it, and we'll say, oh, well, okay, in Judea, it just so happened, despite all perhaps common sense to that they did actually give it to a family or a friend. What would happen then? Well, that person would get a remembered grave. A family or friend would remember where they put them. The trick is that the gospel is very clear that the friends were all gone, and that Mary wasn't influential enough to get the body on her own. Like the gospels, if I'm going to accept the gospels at face value, family and friends didn't get his body.
Whoa. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the second most common scenario for burial for victims, right?
Can I just ask, wasn't there an occasion, and I haven't read Josephus, but wasn't there an occasion in Josephus where Josephus talks about getting some crucified friends?
So yeah, Josephus at one point came upon a battle. He was there to report and to write down, and he actually noticed that 3 people hanging there were his friends. Mm-hmm. And he petitioned to Caesar through the commander who was there, and they let him take those 3 down. Now 2 of them died anyway. They hadn't been up there for very long, but they still died. Mm-hmm. And one was given Caesar's personal physician, and with that personal physician, he came through. So we're not told how those 2 that did die were buried. So, but yes, you are correct in thinking that there is a case of that's the only case we know of that anyone who went up and didn't die, and that is often used to address the Muslim Islam claim that perhaps Jesus was put up on the cross, or anything in the swoon theory category, right? That he was put up and didn't actually die. Historically, that seems pretty implausible, unless you're wanting to say that was a miracle as well, which I think they should just lean into. Just say, well, yeah, because Jesus was fully man and fully God, so of course he's not going to die on the cross because he's he got that God stuff. Anyway,
and talking about fringes, there are people who believe the bitter wine was a psychedelic. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, number.
So on the burial thing, so just.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So on the first, so the most common, no one disputes that. Most common case, Romans just left them. Friends and family did give honorable burials, but the Gospels contradict that. So we could say it's plausible, but that would contradict the Gospels. The third case, what happens is it was up to the Sanhedrin to get all bodies down before nightfall, because that was just one of the commands in Deuteronomy. You weren't supposed to leave someone hanging on the tree. So that's fine. You can say that the Sanhedrin in general, if those first two scenarios fell through, it fell to the Sanhedrin. But there's very strict rules in place that when they do that, they have to place the person in the criminal's graveyard. They had two separate graveyards that they considered the criminal's graveyards, and everyone went there. And the criminal's graveyard was not a marked was they did not take care to mark who was going where, and they definitely, it became an unknown because it was, it was supposed to be again part of the not the punishment, but the observance. They weren't allowed to. If you were the mother of someone buried in the criminal's graveyard, you weren't allowed to go in there and grieve them. Like, it was just a thing that once someone was in that criminal's graveyard, yes, their body was down, but they were basically excommunicated after death, right? They were so those. If that happened, then Jesus' body again would still not be remembered. It would just be somewhere in one of the criminals' graveyards. So we have the three most likely scenarios here, and they all involve people not knowing where Jesus' body is. So all I was going to say was, so what Christians had to do, and you can see this in the legendary development of Josephus, they realized they had a problem with, well, how do we know where Jesus' body was? Now we need to invent someone who was powerful enough to get the body, because we know that Mary didn't get the body because she wasn't powerful enough to go ask for it. But then also not put him where he was supposed to go, not put him in the criminal graveyard where he was supposed to go. So now we had to invent someone who's supposedly on the Sanhedrin who unanimously voted to kill Jesus in the Gospels. A couple hours later, you know what? That guy I just voted unanimously to kill, now I want to get his body and put it, somewhere where it's not supposed to go. So, like,
interesting.
So scholars agree that this is plausible. That story's plausible because we know that exceptions were made for rich and powerful people to sometimes circumvent rules, right? So that's basically what Joseph Arimathea was created for, and or really did. It's this weird plot device you need to rescue Jesus from the three most common things that would have happened to him. So when people come at me and say, well, no, the Joseph Arimathea story is plausible, I say, fine, it's plausible. I don't say it's not plausible. I'm saying it's the fourth most likely thing. So how am I a weird fringe person to say that the three things that are more likely, that represent 100% of the people who aren't named Jesus?
Yeah.
Right? Why am I the fringe person for saying that the thing that happened to everyone else probably also happened to Jesus?
So we're so this is like Back to the Future type thinking for me, but so we have this group of Christians, where the oral tradition of people are still believe in Jesus, and they believe he's coming back, and they believe, and we're going ahead in time now, like after the events. People who have believe they saw the risen Jesus, or there's these stories of this risen Jesus. So then they go, okay, let's formulate the story of his death. And you're saying that now that they're kind of committed to this Christian idea, this Christian theology of Jesus resurrecting, they need to then fill in the gaps of like, well, hang on, how do we? So that's actually interesting. I didn't consider that.
And I don't have the details off the top of my head, but in a project that I'm working on, I actually have column by column the Joseph Arimathea story. And it goes from very simple to incredibly elaborate. And it seems to me like you can actually imagine people saying, okay, so someone on the Sanhedrin took his body. Okay, but why didn't he put him where he was supposed to? And so then in Matthew, when he writes it, he was rich and happened to have a tomb.
Yeah.
Mark didn't mention that, but okay, now, I understand. But then it's like, but wait, didn't he vote to kill Jesus? So then in Luke, all of a sudden it's like, he only went along with it because he didn't want to stir up trouble. He didn't really want to kill Jesus.
I love that.
So in the third time they talk about Joseph, and then by the time you get to John, he was a disciple of Jesus all along. He was like one of the bros, and he was like their deep he's the guy on the council. Sure, he voted to vote for him, but he was with us all along, and that's why, like, when Mary and the other women came up, they were totally cool to hang with him because he and Nathaniel were with him all along. Like, it's legendary development, this Joseph of
I
Arimathea
love
story.
that.
Very few people look at that part of it because, again, is it implausible? No, it's not implausible and it's not impossible, but it's the fourth most likely thing.
Yeah, because you can see. I love when you can see legendary development throughout, the Gospels. Talk about Michael O'Connor a lot on this, but like he challenged me on that. But I think you really can. Like when you look at I said to him I was going to go back and read the Gospels again because I haven't read them in years, like cover to cover. But I really feel like the story of Jesus kind of develops like more and more throughout from Mark to John, and you get more information is added. It's not taken away. And I love when
The other thing about legendary development is you shouldn't actually stop with John, because that's not all the data points. Christians kept writing Gospels, and because they were right, like Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, all those, like, people didn't feel like there was obviously not everyone's answers were solved with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People needed to keep writing the Gospel of Pilate because there was people were asking questions that weren't getting answered, and you start getting more and more elaborate. So the trend line isn't maybe as strong as you want it to be with the first four Gospels, but when you start plugging in all of them, that trend line is strong. Well, I don't know why I should artificially stop my study where the one that you guys decided were close enough to be part of canon. So
okay, so number 4. This I guess I can read it. This Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but most disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard of again, all except Simon Peter and possibly John.
Again, shouldn't be controversial in that if Jesus was a preacher, he had some followers. Now, there's some debate about was it actually 12 or was that a symbolic number, and do the lists of the 12 actually jive, blah, blah. I don't need to get into those weeds. What's most important is that, for my hypothesis, that basically after the events of the ascension in the early Acts, and I don't take Acts as reliable, but for this I'm willing to, Christians come at me about my acceptance of Acts. I don't accept Acts, but I'm using your book. Even if I take your book, only Peter and John are named after the initial thing. So we don't know what Peter, John. So James, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas son of James, Thaddeus, like all the. I think I duplicated some there because they have different weird names depending on which list you're going to. But what did they do? We don't know. They disappear from reliable history. So I acknowledge that we definitely have some really good history about what Peter did. And maybe what John did. The trouble is there's so many guys named John that even the early church fathers was like, which John are they talking about? So that's why I say possibly John, because we don't. Paul met somebody named John, but he doesn't tell us which one. But that said, the other 10, now Judas Iscariot, Christians are going to say, well, he just died. But it's entirely consistent with the book of Acts that all the rest of them just went back to their lives and never talked about Jesus to anyone ever again. There's nothing in the Bible, there's nothing in the early church fathers that precludes the rest of them from just never talking about Jesus again. It's when you get to the 4th century when you start getting this fetish with martyrdom, and then people wanting to come up with, we are the Thomas came and visited our church, so there can be holy relics. When it started to get into later Roman times where Christianity became popular and it actually was a bit of a tourism thing, well, then you wanted to say, well, that Thomas obviously stopped at our church on his way to wherever. Reliable history, I've gone on long enough probably. But that's what I mean by this, is essentially, other than Peter and John, who knows?
Interesting.
So we don't need. So when Christians want to say all the disciples were willing to suffer for their belief that Jesus resurrected from the dead, I will say, show me where they were willing to suffer. We can set that whole martyrdom aside. Just even show me where there's one sermon that they were out doing it. Show me that they talked to one neighbor and said that Jesus rose. We don't have it. So that's
Wow.
that.
But have you read the book Jesus Freaks?
No, but I like the song.
Do you know when I will say when Amy and I were when Amy was giving birth to Atlas, that song was stuck in my head the whole time. It was really frustrating. It was like an earworm I couldn't get out of. Anyway, number 5. Distraught after death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him.
So this is my point of most conjecture. My hypothesis could be definitely minimized in just saying that Simon, well, I guess it is. That's what it says. Simon Peter became mistakenly convinced that Jesus appeared to him. I do like to say that he's a very good candidate for post-bereavement hallucination, which is something that, again, affects a lot of people. It has no correlations with any other kind of mental health problem. So I'm not positing that he was mentally ill or any of this kind of stuff. A huge percentage of people who really loved someone end up feeling like they had some kind of connection with them after they died, and then people want to come at with me. Well, it's sometimes it's visual, but it's not usually visual and auditory. Blah blah blah. Any of the combinations of the sensations. Show me where Peter says that he saw him. Nowhere. Show me that Peter said he heard him. Nowhere. Show me that he smelled him. Nowhere. We don't have any testimony from Peter about what made him think this. It's sad, but even if we accept that First and Second Peter were written by him, which is ridiculous, but if let's say they were, they don't tell us anything, right, about what he said. Let's say Mark was inspired by Peter. Mark tells us literally nothing about what that has no post-resurrection appearances at all. So we just don't have Peter in his own words or even secondary words anywhere telling us what this was like. So you can't come at this and be up. And by the way, multimodal PBHEs absolutely do happen. They're rare, but they absolutely do happen. So even that fits. But my hypothesis doesn't rise or fall on whether it's a PBHE. All we need is that Peter, from whatever set of circumstances, honestly and mistakenly believed Jesus rose. So that's a pretty modest claim, I think, but people can tell me if I'm wrong.
And you can clearly see too, like, if there was such a powerful Jesus movement, people who really did sell their belongings and everything, right? Or even just followers of Jesus who literally believe that he did rise from the dead, forget that. Actually, there's just a lot of people who really love Jesus and were really committed to his cause, willing to die for him, kind of thing. You can so see how, like, rhetoric from "He's with us in spirit," or "I swear I saw him the other day," you can so see how these stories can kind of develop, because it develops in other. Like, there's so many times I was talking to a friend the other day. He has a cousin who died tragically, and for years he kept thinking he saw him when he was walking down the street. He'd go, "Oh, is that? Oh, it's not him." And you can so see how maybe. And again, I have no idea. I'm not an expert in this, but maybe, is it possible that this is just a legendary account that kind of just developed because you've got all these different language groups from the travels of Paul and all these different cultures around this idea, around this Jesus figure, who people are saying things like, maybe I saw him, or he's with us in spirit, and maybe this legendary account kind of starts to grow. I don't know. Maybe it's just.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, the Christians want to say, obviously, it's fine if 12 men or 11 men, if everyone who became a Christian afterwards took the word of 11 men, that's fine. But they all took the word of one guy? That's ridiculous. Well, what's ridiculous about that? There's nothing ridiculous. Of course, single charismatic leaders, we've seen it over and over. Single charismatic leaders convince followers.
Greg Locke, for example.
You name every other religion that
Yeah.
exists, it came out of one person. So why am I the weird one to say that maybe Christianity came from a single enthusiastic charismatic leader? I
Mm.
don't see why that is implausible in any way, other than, well, it contradicts with the Gospels. Well, that we're not here to explain, like I said, the walking on water. We're not here to explain why story details
Mm.
need to be affirmed, because they're not facts on the table. So anyway, that's that one.
Cool.
Social
Number
contagion is actually the word you were maybe looking for on the other,
ah, um,
where basically groups kind of get tied up in a common story, right? And they end up feeling like they were part of it, even if they weren't. So
mm. Number 6. James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement, perhaps also one of the disciples named John.
so the facts that I feel need to be explained are Paul's letters. I feel like Paul's letters are the earliest. I don't feel like it. Paul's letters are the earliest extant writings we have. So how did those come to be is a fact that needs to be explained. Not that they're true, but how did they come to be? Well, Paul claims that he met Peter or James' brother Jesus, and he met someone named John. We don't know if it's John, just some guy named John, but
Mm-hmm.
a pillar of the church. So obviously, James came to be part of the movement. Now, was James a sincere believer? Don't know. We didn't. We have no writing. We don't know. The book of James, again, if the book of James is legit, which few people think is, it doesn't tell us what he believed about any of this. We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it makes a lot of sense that Peter was able to just recruit him and
Mm.
and convince him that his story was correct. That some people want to insist that we'll know that only an actual appearance would have done it. Again, I don't. That doesn't hold up historically. People become convinced by other people all the time,
Mm-hmm.
and if you sincerely believe, then you are willing to go out there and put your neck on the line, as James was. So, I mean, all this is saying is that rather than James becoming convinced outside of Peter, just did Peter convince James? What's so implausible about that?
I don't think that's unimplausible at all. Number 7. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism, with a focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events.
So fortunately, we spent a bunch of time on the podcast already talking about this. I'm talking about here the years between when Jesus died and when the first Gospels were written, whether that be 20 years, whether it be 40 years, doesn't matter. Obviously, people are trying to recruit for Christianity, and that was their priority. The priority was evangelism, not being historically accurate. So they're willing to. People are willing to be hyperbolic when you're trying to convince somebody. You're willing to maybe stretch a story a little bit, or maybe even say, okay, I don't know the answer to how Jesus, how we knew where Jesus's body was, but maybe someone put him in a tomb, and then next time that story gets repeated, it's definitely got put into a tomb. We've seen evangelistic. I call it evangelistic evolution of a story, right? Where basically the story that wins a convert is the one that gets repeated, and then it morphs because you want to convince the next one, and these stories grow again. 20 years of people being evangelists, not historians, leads to stories that win converts, not that accurately reflect history. So that's all that says.
Saul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of an allegedly resurrected Jesus.
So Paul himself says that everything that he knows about Christianity came from visions of Jesus. He seems to, throughout his career later, have had more conversations with Jesus than what he records. So Paul's actions are prompted by visions. Now the question is, would Paul act the same way from a veridical vision, meaning it actually was Jesus, or a non-vertical vision, meaning it wasn't actually him, but that made him believe that it was? So the motive of a person, if if I'm convinced that someone told me, let's say someone told me that my they lied to me and said my dog was on the road, I'm gonna run out there. If I believe them, I'm gonna run out there and try and save my dog, whether or not my dog is actually out there. Right? The
Mm.
actions come from believing the thing, not from the thing being true. Is all that I'm trying to express with that
Mm.
crude analogy there. So everything that Paul did is equally explanatory by that not being a real thing, real
Mm.
vision, but it was just something that was in his head. Can I prove that it wasn't in his head? No, of course not. But we absolutely, it's well documented that people have visions of things, that they believe the visions, but that the visions don't accurately reflect reality.
Mm.
This is super common.
Mm.
So why does my explanation need to include that he really saw a real Jesus versus he saw what he thought was Jesus? People want to say, well, what's the motivation behind that? Because he was out killing Christians. Well, this is not load bearing for my hypothesis, but people sure do change their lives when they feel guilty about something. The whole phenomenon of PTSD in modern day, I'm not saying Paul had PTSD, but that whole phenomenon of PTSD comes from when people come to loathe what they're doing or what they're seeing. They keep doing it for a while. Maybe they keep doing it until they're told to stop. That's fine. But the psychological impacts of them, they need to start constructing some reality about themselves that either makes themselves not the villain, or they do a 180 and want to completely stop doing what they're doing. So
Mm.
if Paul was really out murdering Christians, and he says he was breathing out at least murderous threats, um, you know, killing his fellow Jews in light of what's happening around him with Rome, killing his own people, maybe he decided that's not the best thing,
Mm.
right? There's lots of plausible reasons. Or Paul was, I don't want to say Paul was crazy because we don't describe motive, but who people there are crazy people in the world,
Mm.
and crazy meaning mentally ill, problems, trying to not be derogatory about it at all, but we know that people's chemical balances can do weird stuff. So
Mhm.
it's there's lots of scenarios whereby Paul could have seen something that wasn't really Jesus, and he would have acted in exactly the same way as if it really was Jesus. So this is really just taking off the table anything that Paul did as requiring that a resurrection happened, because he didn't meet Jesus. He doesn't know.
Mm.
Like, anyway, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it did make sense.
Okay.
Number 9, Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye.
We don't need to go into too much detail about this, but definitely, some people want to say, well, they met, so they could have, checked their stories. But when you read the accounts of when they did meet, they were pretty much fighting.
Yeah.
And it seems like the Gospel of Acts and a lot of Christian literature afterwards, it was definitely meant to smooth over what everyone seemed to know, which was that Paul and Peter didn't get along and didn't agree on stuff. Robin Faith Walsh has written some great stuff on this, for example. But yeah, so any notion that they took time to get their stories straight, and that because they took their time to get the stories straight, the stories must be true. There's no evidence for either of those things.
Number 10, several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting the circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives.
So this is obviously referring to what we were talking about before, which is basically the codification of the stories that had been circulating for decades, 20, 40 years, starting to people, the apostles are not, well, I don't think the apostles were around, but people started dying. Jesus wasn't coming back. Maybe we should start writing this stuff down. Of course, you would have access to those growing stories. More than that, even again with Mike Licona's recent book, there's very obvious use of Greek literary devices in there. There's very obvious use of mining the Old Testament to find parallels. And And who knows? And there's obviously also answering polemics, right? The authors were using their books to answer specific challenges. So, you combine all these things together, and the gospels that we see make a lot of sense. And they absolutely don't require that a first person witness was involved, because they don't read that way.
Number 11, occasionally some early Christians engaged in disruptive behavior and faced consequences as a result.
I like to put this point in there partially because people do like to throw the whole why would people die for a lie thing, as I'm talking about. If Peter and Paul were both sincere in their belief, then absolutely they would go and die for it. They doesn't
Yeah,
you will die for anything you're sincerely holding to. Those are the two we have solid evidence that they were killed. Now, oddly, they were both said to be killed under Nero, who was said to be killing Christians just as a scapegoat for him setting a fire. So it actually didn't matter if they recanted or not. They were the figureheads of the movement he was using as a scapegoat. So of course he's going to kill them, no matter what they said. But the other thing people want to throw out there, of course, maybe lots of these people were witnesses, blah blah blah. Well, there's not great evidence that Christians were treated as harshly in a general sense as Christians often like to think. Candida Moss has a great book on this. Bart Ehrman's Triumph of Christianity is also a good book on this. Just the notion that in that first 100 years that every single one of them was hiding in their basement. Now, there was definitely some killing, and I don't condone that, and it's terrible. But it wasn't every Christian that was hiding and was doing this only because they were super committed to it, right? There were definitely casual, I'm a Christian and my life is fine.
Yeah, and I just never understood that point about why would they die for something if it wasn't true. And it's like, well, have you seen like any Islamic extremist terrorist? Like, I mean, what do you mean? Like, I'm sorry. Like, what do you think happened on 9/11? Do you think that they didn't believe what they believed? Like, they really believed what they believed. Obviously,
Well, this is why they need for there to be not minimal witnesses but maximal witnesses, because they need every martyr to have been a personal witness to differentiate between the 9/11 terrorists and killers who just were firmly committed, because they want to say that these people were in a position to know what they believed is true or not. And I'm saying the evidence doesn't show that. Peter and John were in a position to be sincerely convinced. No one else was. And if they were sincerely convinced, then this whole martyrdom thing is no evidence at all and of no consequence.
And the last point, number 12, centuries later in 303 AD, Christianity was temporarily outlawed in Rome, but it gained legal protection 10 years later and soon became the Roman Empire's first official religion, marking its transformation towards the institution we know today. I mean, that point is
super non-controversial,
but non-controversial.
Yeah, people actually even wonder why I put this in here. Partially because I like the number 12, because Christians like the number 12, but also it kind of drives home. What I'm attempting to explain is, how do we have the church? How do we have modern church? Because the only thing you can't dispute is that Christianity exists, right? Like, you can dispute whether the Gospels are true, you can dispute all those things, but you can't. If anyone comes to me and is a church myther, they come up to me and say, no, Christianity doesn't even exist. You made it up in your head. No, it does. So we need to explain. My hypothesis is attempt to explain Christianity, not the Bible. So I put that in here largely because, again, anything after 303 can definitely be attributed to this being a state religion, more so than that it has to be true.
Wow. So that is your minimal witnesses hypothesis. And I think it's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. And I want to reread the New Testament when I get some time, but between everything else I'm reading, to kind of massage that kind of idea into the text and see how well it kind of sits with me at reading everything. But definitely, and congratulations, by the way, on getting on Bart Ehrman's blog. That's
thanks.
That must be like
So if you look at the minimal facts, that Gary Habermas or Michael Economou put forth, the only thing that it rubs against, so they want to say that all the disciples had their lives changed. And I just point out that you don't have support for that. You cannot go to historians and say that historians would point that all the disciples' lives changed. What historians say is some disciples' lives were changed, right? And as soon as you're saying some, you can say two. So
that's great. So
yeah.
just to end this podcast, I've got two quick clips I want to show you, Paul. And
All right.
these, I think, just show, if you're a Christian, you're watching this, and I hope you're all watching this. It's always good to challenge your beliefs. I try to challenge my beliefs all the time. Apologetics, I think, is a sneaky game. I don't care whether or not you're a Christian apologist or a Muslim apologist or a Mormon apologist. I think that a lot of the time it's quite convincing, but I think that when you look at the data, it's not as, without all the fluff around it, it's not as convincing. So I just want to show two quick clips. One is from Frank Turek, and it's a 2-minute clip. How to prove the resurrection in less than 2 minutes. I'm sorry to put everyone through this, but here we go. And we can commentate on it at the end.
There's only two possibilities when it comes to the resurrection. It either happened or it didn't happen, right? If it happened, then Jesus is Lord. You've heard Lord, Liar, Lunatic, right? Okay, he's the Lord, okay? If it didn't happen, either the apostles, the New Testament writers, lied, or what's the other option? They were deceived. They were mistaken, right? They thought he had resurrected from the dead, and they went and died for it, but he didn't really die, or he didn't really rise from the dead. Now, why are these two things implausible? Well, they had no motive to lie about the resurrection, as we've already pointed out, right? Because all they got, they were beaten, tortured, and killed for saying it was true. In fact, they had a big motive to deny the resurrection. They're Jews.
I mean, obviously the first point, if Jesus resurrected, he's Lord. I mean, fine. I mean, that oddly, I think a lot of skeptics would want to say, well, that doesn't mean that everything he said was correct, but I'm fine. Let's go. We'll leave that one alone for now.
Yeah.
If it didn't happen, were they lying or mistaken? I totally agree. I actually don't think they were lying, so I would tend to go along with what he's saying. But what he's saying there are absolutely not, so are not correct though. No motive to lie. You're talking about people who were out living. They went from being laborers mostly, or hated tax collectors, to a life where they were celebrities. They were going around preaching, welcomed, sometimes not welcomed, but they were definitely, like, they were getting fed. There was definitely ego and stuff attached to this. Cult leaders, gain utility out of this stuff. So no, absolutely, there would have been motive to lie. You absolutely can imagine anyway. Scenarios.
They're part of a movement. Like, even if, like, it doesn't matter, even if there was no glory or anything in it, they're part of a movement. And that's like the sunk cost fallacy. If you've sold your stuff, if you've sold your fishing boat and you're like following this preacher around, and then, or philosopher around, it happens all the time with, yeah.
So I that's overly dismissive. Well, he talked about, again, he threw out this notion that they were suffering for this claim. Frank, I would love for you to demonstrate for me one of anyone not named Peter or Paul who was even putting themselves, forget the actually martyred, was even out preaching, out putting themselves in harm's way to be harmed, right? We just don't have that. It's the narrative that they want to spin, but it's imaginary.
Yeah.
They don't want to get kicked out of the temple. They don't want to be excommunicated. They don't want to be thrown out of the chosen people club. Why would they do this? Could they have been mistaken? Well, they had no explanation.
So just pause for a sec there. So the other thing that Frank's narrative relies on is this very unreliable version of Judaism that is insulting to Jewish people. That is that all Jews at the time thought there was groupthink, or as Dr. Levine was on my channel. She's a Jewish scholar, and she calls it the Christians think there was Jew think, and that you can just say the Jews think X or Jews think Y. That absolutely is not a thing. We know, especially from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there was significant variation in what the Messiah, for example, was supposed to look like. There was the notion of a royal Messiah. There was a notion of a Messiah like Jesus, a suffering Messiah. There was a notion of sometimes two Messiahs. One was supposed to, wage the war, and one was supposed to do some other stuff. Like there's, Frank is lying on this again. Christians took over Judaism, right? It's in the same way Mormons took over Christianity, and and warp it. And Christians hate that, what they've done. Jewish people hate what Christianity did to their book, and that is, steal it. So before you accept Frank's words on what Jews would or wouldn't do, first of all, realize that there's no single thing that they all agreed upon. That's why you had Pharisees and Sadducees and other groups that are all warring and disagreeing, and all those other first century apocalyptic leaders, the Egyptian and Simon and the different people who were able to raise up their own tens of thousands of followers, to do things. That's just like you can't say that I don't want to hold this view because I'm a Christian. Well, no, I can't hold to evolution because I don't want to, because the Christians will hate me. Well, no, some of the Christians will, but others will. Anyway, it's a point that that the more I get involved with Jewish studies, the more I know that that's a friction point for them.
I remember I was on a I think it was Diablo Critics, and someone kept saying, "Stop trying to read Jesus into the Old Testament." I'm like, that's what I do. That's
mistaken. Well, they had no expectation of a resurrection. They weren't expecting a resurrection, and then maybe saw him and assumed he had risen from the dead when he really hadn't. They weren't expecting it. And if they were mistaken, they could have easily been corrected by enemies showing Jesus's dead body. They could have just gone to the tomb and taken out Jesus's body and said, stop all this nonsense talk about the resurrection.
So we went over it, but not if people didn't know where Jesus' body was, but also not if we're talking about decades afterwards, right? Like you pull out you're going to pull out a 20-year-old body when the when Christianity really started picking up and the Gospels were written. If you want to see, and it's probably more like 40 years. What's a 40-year-old corpse going to prove to me? Nothing. They're going to deny that it's Jesus.
But like
I don't know what Weekend at Bernie's situation they think is happening here.
There's also what kind of this is injecting such a post Constantine version of Christianity into, like, as if this was, at the time everyone knew this was like the biggest event, and all of Jerusalem were like, in song and dance about like, is Jesus really the Son of God? And like everyone was like focusing on this and trying to work it out. No, this was like way later. Like no one was expecting, like this is all way later theology. You know what I mean? Like I just don't. It didn't seem, even when reading the text, it doesn't seem to be that important. I mean, the dead supposedly rose and started preaching to people in Jerusalem. Yeah. But besides that, I mean, only one gospel kind of mentions that. No other historian kind of mentions the zombies. But
Christians sometimes now talk to me about how, you produce the body of Jesus and I'll stop believing. I'm like, how many bodies would I have to show you for you to think that one of them was Jesus? Like,
I know.
Talk about the resurrection. He's dead. They didn't do that. Why? Because he wasn't dead. So, seems to me it really did happen, and this is the conclusion. Jesus is Lord, and if Jesus is Lord, then all we need to do is see what he wants us to do. Right?
Yeah. All of Frank's points to explain why people couldn't be lying or mistaken were ridiculous. And the other thing about, so I mean, even if you want to be really convinced that they couldn't have been lying, fine. The thing about being mistaken is you don't know you're mistaken.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so if you are mistakenly thinking that Jesus is resurrected, then your old theology isn't going to bother you. You're going to figure out, like most of the gospel writers did, oh, how does my theology work in this new piece of information that someone did rise from the dead? The fact that yesterday I didn't think that was a thing that was going to happen, it doesn't matter, because now I'm convinced that it did. So now I'm adjusting my theology. Like, it's Frank is not good at this. Anyway, that's all I would say.
Frank drives me nuts. I just think he picks and chooses certain things, and
I was on Unbelievable with Frank once, and that was very frustrating. It was about Star Wars, so it was, even more.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. I'll have to go check that out.
Sure.
So one thing so this is the crux of it, and this next clip, I don't think we won't pause it, we won't commentate on it, but I just
sounds good.
What I want to do is I want to show it to you, because what do you know about Mormonism?
Not enough.
Okay, so when I think of Mormonism, I think of, and I hope this isn't offensive to anybody, but I didn't grow up with the Mormon idea and stuff, so it is laughably, definitely not true. It is just definitely not. The golden plates, everything is not true, right? But I found this clip when I was deconstructing, and I recently refound it again because I wanted to show people how convincing apologetics can be if you word things in a certain way. So this is some apologetics from the evidences for the Book of Mormon, the plates. So I just want to see if you can see. We'll watch a couple of minutes of it, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. And I just want to. We can discuss at the end. We can discuss at the end the techniques and see if any of them are the same. But let's watch this. So this is evidences for the Book of Mormon, the golden plates that Joseph Smith deciphered from ancient Egyptian languages. Okay, here we go.
Introduced at the beginning of every copy of the Book of Mormon are the testimonies of the 3 and 8 witnesses. These 3 witnesses, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, wrote that they were shown the plates by an angel, who also attested to them that Joseph Smith translated the book by the gift and power of God. It would be easy to say that these 3 men conspired with Joseph Smith, only giving their testimony of the angel and the gold plates to perpetuate a scam. But that explanation loses its strength when we consider that all 3 men eventually left the church, having at some point fallen out with Joseph Smith. Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris later rejoined the church after Smith's death, but David Whitmer would remain estranged for the rest of his life. Despite their falling out with Smith, all 3 maintained their testimony of having seen the angel and the gold plates. In fact, David Whitmer famously went out of his way on numerous occasions to give interviews and correct newspapers he felt had misrepresented his testimony. Once he wrote, "Those who know me best know that I have always adhered to that testimony, and that no man may be misled or doubt my present views in regards to the same. I do again affirm the truth of my statements." The fact that these men never wavered in their testimony of the plates dismantles the claim of collusion. After all, they had everything to lose and nothing to gain by maintaining their testimonies after falling away from the church. And yet, each, independently of the others, insisted that their published testimony was true, whatever their disagreements with Joseph Smith may have been. With collusion being highly unlikely, others have questioned whether the 3 witnesses could have been hallucinating. Some sources quote the witnesses as saying that they saw the plates with their spiritual eyes, or with the eye of faith, which some take to mean they only imagined the plates and the angel. But that sort of language is scriptural in nature, and doesn't automatically imply hallucination. Rather, it means that the witnesses were prepared for a visionary experience in the scriptural sense. David Whitmer made this clear in an interview published in 1888. "Of course we were in the spirit when we had a view of the plates, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view, but we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it was at any time." Whitmer insisted that he was not under any hallucination during the vision, saying, "I saw with these eyes." One might still not be convinced by the witness given by Cowdery, Harris, and Whitmer, thinking it sounds too ethereal with an angel showing them the plates. This is where the testimony of the 8 witnesses comes in, as they were given the simple, straightforward opportunity to handle the plates directly. No angel arrayed in glorious light is described by Oliver Cowdery. They simply wrote that, as many of the leaves as the said smith has translated, we did handle with our hands, and we also saw the engravings thereon, all of which has the appearance of ancient work and of curious workmanship. Once again, collusion is unlikely, given that 3 of the 8 witnesses were either excommunicated or left the church. And as with the 3 witnesses, they never recanted their testimony as published in the Book of Mormon. To explain the testimony of the 8 witnesses, some think that Joseph Smith fabricated a set of tin or lead plates that he used to trick them with. However, there is no credible historical evidence that Joseph Smith somehow faked a set of plates, let alone that he had the wherewithal to do so. Martin Harris, before he became one of the 3 witnesses, held the plates while they were in a wooden chest, and knew that they must have been either lead or gold. But Riley added that Joseph had not enough credit to buy so much lead. This theory also ignores the testimony of those who saw the...
All right.
We'll end it there, but are you a Mormon now?
I'm definitely... Oh my goodness, this testimony.
Isn't it incredible though? Isn't it incredible that I laugh at the idea of and I'm not trying to be offensive to any members of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but for me it's so out there. I didn't grow up with it, so it's as silly as someone who looks at Christianity or Hinduism or Islam or any of them who has no concept. It's very silly to me, and I just go, absolutely no way. There's absolutely no way that this would be a true thing that exists in this world. But yet that was very convincing, Okay, well,
honestly, it's better in some ways than the Christian version, because newspapers and like other people were able to cross-examine the people, in their own way. No one cross-examined any of these supposed Christian witnesses that we have reporting of, for example. So I mean, it's already better. So yeah, so why aren't Christians who believe on the testimony of the disciples, they should believe this testimony? I'm with you.
It's really, I remember when I watched that, I was like, wow, like I just, it really helped me in some of that deconstruction angst of like, wow, I can really be misled. I can be easily misled. With things.
And well done juxtaposing Frank Turek, because there was some of the same phraseology, which was delicious. Yeah.
It's amazing, isn't it? And it's the same for
why would they lie? There's no reason anyone would lie. Yeah.
And that's the same thing. Islamic apologists do the same thing. They do things where they'll point to certain things like washing the face and the hands, and say that the Quran was teaching us the germ theory of disease, things like that.
Right. Yeah.
It's just interesting to look at that with everything that we've talked about today on Deep Drinks podcast. It's just interesting to look at that and go, wow, like look at other apologetics from other religions and go, okay, there's a little bit of the same vibe going on that, and it's convincing. It's good rhetoric. Convincing rhetoric is what I don't mean it's convincing in like I'm actually being convinced. I mean the rhetoric, right. It works. Mm-hmm. Well, with all that said, thank you so much for coming on Deep Drinks podcast, Paul.
Very enjoyable.
I don't know when this video is coming out, but I will shout out your channel, Paulogia. It is an awesome channel. Like I said, I've been a subscriber for ages, and I recently made it, Mum. I recently made it. I was, my face was on Paulogia, which is such an honor. I don't know where that episode actually is. Is it the
what is the one I'm talking about with Mike Lacona? I don't know which.
Maybe oh yes, it's this one here. Yeah, there I am. Hey, so it's an awesome episode. Go check out this episode. It's Paul reviewing the episode with Michael Lacona. I told Mike that I wasn't going to make any hit pieces on him or anything like that after the episode.
Very good.
This is I find this really interesting because you push back on some of his points that I found that I hadn't had the chance to kind of think about more deeply. But of course, go check out Paulogia, an amazing channel. And have you got any like big projects that are coming up that might be released when this kind of comes out?
I'm working on. So you're seeing the top 2 that are there for you. There's the Genesis History and the T-Rex 8 Watermelon. I'm working on actually a follow-up to those. So I'm taking a tour back into my young Earth creation days just for a month. So we'll hit some of that.
Well, on that fun note, Everyone go check out Paulogia, and I'll see you guys next time. It's been awesome. Thanks for coming on, Paul.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone who financially supports this channel, and a special thank you to the Archbishops of Deep Drinks, Jason Rollins, Matthew Monga, Digital Hammurabi, and Eric from Skeptics and Scoundrels. If you'd like to support this channel and see a cartoon avatar of yourself, check out patreon.com/deepdrinks.